In 2020, a guy with 2 beehives in the back corner of his property made about $1,000. This year, 6 months in, that same operation has already crossed $250,000. No inheritance, no outside investors, no viral moment. Just bees, a lot of trial and error, and a series of decisions that most beginning beekeepers never even think to make. By the end of this video, you'll know exactly what those decisions were, in what order he made them, and which one of them alone was responsible for a 5 times return in a single year. Let's get into it. The story starts, oddly enough, not with honey at all, but with a bomb squad. The man behind this operation spent time in the Army working explosive ordnance disposal, and he came home carrying post-traumatic stress that medication wasn't handling the way he needed it to. A fellow veteran who kept bees suggested he try it, mentioning that the VA itself had studied beekeeping as a calming activity for veterans dealing with PTSD. There's something almost meditative built into the mechanics of it. You cannot work a hive quickly or carelessly. Bees respond to fast, jerky movement with aggression, so the entire practice forces you to slow down, breathe, and stay completely present in what your hands are doing. That combination of forced calm and quiet focus is apparently powerful enough that it's now used as a recognized therapeutic activity for veterans across the country. So in 2020, with no intention of building a business, he bought 2 hives, a suit, gloves, a smoker, and a hive tool. Total cost, under $500. He named the operation after where he put those first 2 hives tucked away on the far back corner of the property, half hidden from view, because his wife wasn't exactly thrilled about the idea at first. A secret garden of bees, essentially. That name stuck, and it's still the name on every bottle he sells today. Here's where it gets interesting, because the growth curve on this business is almost a perfect case study in what patient, deliberate scaling actually looks like, as opposed to the overnight success story most people expect. Year 1, that original 2-hive setup brought in right around $1,000. Not a lot of money by any measure, but it was enough to qualify the operation as a legitimate farm for state tax purposes, which mattered more than the dollar figure suggests, because it unlocked agricultural classifications and benefits that would matter enormously later. Year 2, revenue jumped to $10,000, and that year wasn't really about the bees at all. It was about everything surrounding them. Getting the branding right, designing labels that actually looked premium, figuring out bottle sizes, nailing down pricing, and building the operational systems that would let the business handle real volume once the hive count started climbing. Year 3, revenue exploded to $100,000, largely because that was the year he cracked into retail, landing placement in a regional upscale grocery chain. And by year 4, 6 months into the calendar year alone, the business had already crossed $250,000, on pace to roughly double the prior year's total. Margins tell a similar story of patient improvement. In the early years, profit margins sat around 20%, mostly because there was no economy of scale yet. Every jar was produced at painstaking, manual, small batch cost. Once the operation hit real scale, margins climbed into the 40 to 50% range, which is a massive difference when you're talking about hundreds of thousands of dollars in annual revenue. Now let's talk about the actual hives, because this is where a lot of aspiring beekeepers get their expectations wrong from the very start. There's no such thing as a native North American honeybee. Every single honeybee working a hive in this country descends from imported stock, most commonly Italian honeybees, prized specifically because they're calm, gentle to work with, and prolific honey producers. You can start a hive one of 2 ways. You can buy what's called a package, roughly 3 pounds of live bees, along with a queen, shipped to you through the actual postal service in a ventilated box. Or you can buy what's called a nucleus colony, a small starter colony that already includes several frames of bees, a laying queen, and some stored honey and brood, which gives your new hive a substantially stronger head start than a raw package does. A nucleus colony typically runs around $150. Physically, a hive is built in stacked boxes. The bottom boxes, called deeps, are where the colony actually lives, raises brood, and stores honey for its own survival through the winter. On top of those sit smaller boxes called honey supers, and this is genuinely the financial heart of the entire operation. because the honey stored in the supers is the surplus the beekeeper actually harvests and sells. The bees fill the deeps first to take care of themselves, and only once those are full do they start filling the supers with the excess that becomes product. In a strong year, a single hive might produce around 100 pounds of harvestable honey. In a rough year, that number can drop to 60 or 65 pounds, at a wholesale average of roughly $20 a pound. Do that math across even a modest number of hives, and you start to understand how 62 hives, which is roughly where this operation sits today, generates the kind of revenue it does. A basic starter setup: one suit, one smoker, one hive tool, a couple of hives, and the bees themselves, runs a beginner somewhere under $500, which is genuinely one of the lowest barriers to entry of almost any small agricultural venture you could name. But scaling that starter kit into something resembling a real production operation is where the real capital requirement shows up. A single assembled hive box, ready to populate, runs roughly $50 once you include the wooden frames inside it, and a serious operation goes through something like 1,000 replacement frames in a given year as colonies expand and old comb gets rotated out. At that volume, frames arrive by the pallet, which is exactly why this particular operation ended up needing a forklift just to move incoming freight off delivery trucks. What looks, from the outside, like a quiet backyard hobby quickly turns into something closer to a small warehouse logistics operation once you're managing dozens of hives instead of two. But raw honey volume was never actually the constraint on this business. The real bottleneck, and the thing that separated a hobby from a company, turned out to be something almost nobody thinks about when they picture beekeeping: bottling. For the first couple of years, filling jars meant literally pouring honey from a 5-gallon bucket, cracking a small gate valve, letting it drip into a bottle by hand, capping the bottle, wiping up the inevitable sticky mess, and repeating that process one jar at a time. At that pace, bottling a single batch of 1,000 pounds of honey took somewhere around 80 hours of pure manual labor. Once the business invested roughly $20,000 into proper heated holding tanks and an automated filling machine, that same 1,000 pounds could be bottled in about 8 hours. That's a 10 times improvement in labor efficiency from one piece of equipment, and it directly enabled the jump from $100,000 in annual revenue to $250,000, because the operation could suddenly move volume that would have been physically impossible to bottle by hand. And here's a detail that matters enormously if you're thinking about starting any kind of small agricultural business yourself. That $20,000 equipment purchase barely cost the business owner anything out of pocket, because there are small farmer grant programs at both state and federal levels, specifically designed to help operations like this acquire exactly this kind of production equipment. Out of that full $20,000 purchase, his actual out-of-pocket cost landed somewhere around $2,000. The rest came through grant funding that most beginning farmers never even think to apply for, simply because they don't know it exists. That wasn't the only overlooked funding source either. A surprising amount of the operation's heavier equipment, a forklift, a pickup truck, even a fully enclosed, climate-controlled trailer, originally used for space launch operations, was acquired through a federal surplus program that allows veterans to receive decommissioned government equipment directly, often for little more than a modest processing fee. A forklift with a retail value around $40,000 cost roughly $500 in transfer fees. A pickup truck ran about $1,000. The launch operations trailer, repurposed into a fully enclosed extraction facility, cost a few $100s and a long drive to pick it up. For a veteran willing to do the paperwork, that program alone can be the difference between financing tens of thousands of dollars in equipment and acquiring it for a few hundred. Extraction itself came with its own hard-learned lesson. In the early days, harvesting honey happened during the day, in an open barn, which sounds perfectly reasonable until you remember that pulling honey out of a hive in broad daylight is essentially ringing a dinner bell for every bee within scent range. Within about an hour of starting one early extraction session, the operation was surrounded by what was, by rough estimate, somewhere around 100,000 agitated bees, forcing a complete stop and a full rethink of the process. The fix turned out to be simple. Extraction now happens entirely at night, starting around 9 in the evening and running until the early morning hours while the bees are dormant. wrapping up before they wake and start actively foraging again. Now let's talk about where the real profit sits, because this is the part most people trying to start a small food business get completely backwards. Packaging and positioning did more for this business's margins than almost anything related to the bees themselves. Early on, the decision was made to deliberately position the product for upscale customers and premium retail placement rather than competing on volume at the lowest possible price point. That meant a glass bottle instead of plastic, a natural cork closure imported directly from Portugal rather than a cheap screw cap, and a custom label that took roughly 18 months of iteration, working with a graphic designer and testing different versions directly on customers to finally land on. All of that adds real cost to each bottle, but it also justifies a retail price that a generic plastic bottle simply couldn't command. Depending on the store, a small bottle retails for $10 to $14, and the larger bottle runs anywhere from $20 up to as much as $40 in certain premium locations. Meanwhile, the actual production cost per bottle sits at roughly $4 to $6. That gap between production cost and shelf price is where the real money in this business lives, far more than in the honey itself. Retail distribution followed a pattern worth understanding if you ever want to get a small food product into real grocery chains. Rather than cold emailing corporate buyers, the approach was to walk into individual store locations, build a relationship directly with local store managers, and ask who to call at the corporate level. Persistent, repeated follow-up calls eventually got a callback. Big retail chains, it turns out, are often eager to work with small, reliable local producers. They just struggle to find ones they trust to actually deliver consistently. The first deal wasn't a full chain rollout either. It started as a trial run in just 6 stores, essentially a test to confirm the product would actually sell and that the business could reliably deliver and invoice like a real supplier. Once that trial proved out, the retailer expanded placement to 60 stores and eventually to 170. One single expansion decision by that retailer generated a wholesale order worth over $46,000 in a single transaction. There's also a surprisingly specific placement detail worth knowing if you ever get honey, or frankly any specialty food product, into a grocery store. Honey can legally be shelved in either the general grocery aisle or the produce section. And produce sections tend to attract shoppers who are already primed to spend more on food they perceive as higher quality or healthier. Deliberately targeting produce section placement, rather than getting lost on a generic grocery shelf, measurably improved sales performance across multiple retail accounts. It's worth noting that wholesale and direct retail aren't remotely equal in terms of what they actually pay the producer. Selling directly through the farm's own retail relationships rather than through a wholesale distribution arrangement, generates roughly 30% more revenue per unit sold. That's a meaningful enough gap that most small producers eventually try to shift as much volume as they reasonably can toward direct or retail partner relationships rather than pure wholesale, even though wholesale volume is usually what gets a young business to meaningful scale in the first place. Right now, direct and retail sales still make up only around a quarter of total volume for this particular operation, with the rest moving through wholesale channels, which suggests there's still real margin upside sitting on the table as that mix shifts over time. Direct-to-consumer sales matter too, even for a business this size. A simple, self-serve farm stand, built for under $1,000 using basic materials, now generates roughly $500 a week in sales. Nearly all of it running on an honor system, where customers show up, take what they want, and leave payment behind. That's about $2,000 a month from a structure that paid for itself within its very first weeks of operation. It's a small piece of overall revenue, but it's close to pure margin, and it took almost no ongoing labor to maintain. Not every part of this story is a smooth upward line, and it's worth being honest about that, because the risk side of running any agricultural business is real. A hard winter freeze that lasted about a week and a half wiped out 14 hives in a single season, a real financial hit for any beekeeping operation of this size. But because winter colony loss was already identified as a known risk and specifically insured through a federal crop insurance program designed for beekeepers, that loss came with a real financial cushion attached, rather than becoming a business-ending disaster. That's the value of treating risk management as a planning exercise from the beginning, rather than something you only think about after a disaster has already happened. There's also a structural mistake worth flagging honestly, because it's a genuinely common one. The business was set up initially as a sole proprietorship, simply because that was the easiest option when it was still a small side hobby with no real growth plan attached. Once revenue and complexity grew, restructuring into a proper LLC would have offered real liability protection and tax advantages. But by that point, so many grants, programs, and agreements were already tied to the sole proprietorship structure that unwinding and converting it became genuinely difficult. If there's one piece of paperwork advice worth taking away from this whole story, it's to set up the proper legal business structure right at the very beginning, even when revenue is zero, because untangling that decision later is far harder than getting it right from day one. There's one more overlooked funding avenue worth knowing, particularly for veterans specifically. Federal workforce development programs exist that will reimburse a business a significant percentage, in this case 75%, of a new apprentice's wages during their first several hundred hours of on-the-job training. Stack that with a separate federal tax credit available specifically for hiring disabled veterans, and the combined savings on a single new employee's first-year salary can run into the tens of thousands of dollars. Most small business owners never apply for either program, purely because nobody ever tells them these programs exist. So here's the real takeaway underneath all of this. The honey itself was never really the hard part. Bees, left alone in reasonably decent conditions, are going to make honey regardless of who's managing the hive. The actual business, the part that turned a $500 hobby into a $250,000 operation, was built entirely on decisions that had almost nothing to do with beekeeping itself. Premium packaging over cheap packaging, produce section placement over a generic grocery shelf, government surplus equipment instead of full retail price purchases, grant-funded machinery instead of a business loan, insured risk instead of uninsured hope. Every single one of those decisions is available to basically any small agricultural producer willing to do the homework, and almost none of them require you to already have money. If you're sitting on some version of a backyard hobby right now, whether that's bees, a garden, or something else entirely, the lesson here isn't that you need bees specifically. It's that the boring, unglamorous business decisions sitting behind the product are usually worth more than the product itself. Figure those out first, and the actual thing you're selling has a real shot at becoming something a lot bigger than a backyard hobby. Notice, too, how much of this growth came from money that was already sitting on the table, waiting for someone to fill out the right paperwork. Grant-funded equipment, surplus government machinery, apprenticeship wage reimbursement, veteran hiring tax credits, crop loss insurance built specifically for beekeepers. None of that required outside investors or a bank loan with strings attached. It required research, patience, and a willingness to sit on hold with a few government offices. That's not a glamorous part of the story, but it's arguably the single biggest lever separating a business that plateaus at a modest side income from one that quietly crosses $250,000 a year, while its owner still calls it a farm rather than a company.